She begged a man who owned half of Seoul's skyline to destroy her in public. And the terrifying part wasn't that he agreed. It was how easily he made everyone believe it. If you believe love shouldn't have to beg for permission to exist, hit that subscribe button now. Because in a city built on silence and men who collect what they can't have, staying quiet is how the villains win. Like this story, if you're rooting for Amara. Only the cold-hearted scroll past without subscribing. Nobody warns you that the most dangerous rooms in the world smell like champagne and lilies. Amara had learned that the hard way, standing at the edge of a ballroom dripping in crystal, surrounded by men who could end careers with a phone call and women whose smiles cost more than her rent. She used to think mafia was a word reserved for movies with too much cologne and not enough subtlety. Seoul had corrected that assumption within her first year, quietly, the way this city corrected everything, with a smile and a price tag. 2 years ago, she'd arrived with a suitcase, a curator's degree nobody in Korea seemed to respect, and the kind of stubborn optimism that gets beaten out of most immigrants by month 6. She'd survived a boss's nephew who mistook her existence for an invitation. She'd survived landlords who misplaced her rental applications. What she had not survived, what she suspected she would never survive, was Kang Min-jae looking at her like she was the only unregulated variable in a life he'd spent 15 years perfecting. He didn't look like danger. That was the joke of it. Danger, in her experience, usually announced itself. A scowl, a scar, a name whispered with a flinch. Min-jae wore tailored charcoal suits and the patience of a man who'd never once needed to raise his voice, because everyone in the room had already decided to be afraid of him before he opened his mouth. He ran 3 ports and a half a shipping empire on paper. Off paper, he ran considerably more, and Amara had learned not to ask which parts of his empire moved through customs and which moved through the kind of silence that customs never touches. "You're doing the face again," he said, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of something she couldn't pronounce and definitely couldn't afford. "What face?" "The one where you're calculating the exits." "Occupational habit." She took the glass. "Working in a gallery full of men who think no is a starting offer will do that to a woman. You work in my gallery now." Which somehow makes the men more insufferable, not less. Ownership seems to be contagious. He almost smiled. The closest thing his face did to public weather. It was, she'd decided months ago, the most expensive thing she'd ever been given for free. They'd built their entire relationship out of stolen minutes exactly like this one. Barbed jokes traded across rooms full of people who would happily report either of them for the wrong reasons. He sent flowers imported from places with worse carbon footprints than his shipping routes. She sent back lectures on sustainability that he read twice, unimpressed, and she suspected, secretly delighted. He offered a driver. She took the bus at rush hour just to watch him worry from a car 3 vehicles back, pretending he wasn't following her at all. It should have stayed small, contained. A controlled exception in a man who did not tolerate variables. Except love, as it turns out, does not sign contracts. It does not respect NDAs, territory lines, or the delicate architecture of a criminal empire built on the assumption that Kang Min-jae felt nothing for anyone. And somewhere in the last 6 months, without either of them scheduling it, that assumption had become a lie, standing in a designer dress at his side, sipping champagne she couldn't pronounce, in a room full of people who were very good at noticing lies. She didn't know yet about the folded note waiting on her doorstep, the photograph of her walking to work, the 6 words that would rewrite everything. He has enemies who collect what he loves. She didn't know that within the week, her closest friend would be pulled aside by immigration officers asking oddly specific questions, or that her landlord would suddenly discover concerns about her lease. She didn't know that a black sedan would learn the exact rhythm of her front steps. Right now, she only knew that Kang Min-jae had just stolen a strawberry off her dessert plate with the casual entitlement of a man who owned 3 ports, and apparently her fruit too. And that somewhere behind his usual composure, something had softened in a way dangerous men are not supposed to allow. Across the ballroom, a stranger watched them both with the patient attention of a man cataloging a weakness for later use. He raised his glass to no one in particular and smiled. The note arrived on a Tuesday, which felt insulting in its own right. Amara had always assumed catastrophe had better scheduling instincts. That ruin announced itself on dramatic Fridays or ominous Sundays, not on a plane. Forgettable Tuesday sandwiched between grocery shopping and a dentist appointment she'd later cancel and never reschedule. It was folded in quarters, tucked under her doormat like a flyer for a pizza place that didn't exist. No signature, no return address, just a photograph, grainy, taken from across the street, of her walking to work in the gray coat she wore on days she couldn't be bothered to perform confidence, and 6 words beneath it in blocky, deliberate handwriting. He has enemies who collect what he loves. She read it 4 times before her brain agreed to translate it from abstract threat into something with teeth. Then she folded it back into its quarters, placed it in the drawer with her passport and emergency cash, and did what any reasonable woman does when faced with a message clearly meant to unravel her. She went to work and pretended, with the practiced ease of someone who'd been pretending her whole immigrant life, that everything was fine. It was not fine. By Thursday, her closest friend, a Nigerian nurse named Adies, who'd fed Amara real food twice a week since her first homesick month in Seoul, got pulled into a small gray room at her hospital by 2 immigration officers asking pointed questions about a visa that had been perfectly valid for 6 years. By Friday, Amara's landlord called with an apologetic voice and an unapologetic message. There were concerns about renewing her lease, concerns he couldn't quite name, concerns that had materialized out of nothing the way concerns do when someone pays enough for them to exist. By Saturday, a black sedan had learned the exact rhythm of her front steps, parked across the street for 3 consecutive nights. Engine idling, windows tinted the particular shade of "we know you see us, and we don't care." She told no one. Not ADAs, who had enough to worry about. Not Min Jae, who she suspected would respond to a threat against her the way a hurricane responds to a beach umbrella. She'd survived plenty on her own. A childhood that taught her early that asking for help was a currency she rarely had enough of. A career that taught her twice as hard for half the credit. A country that taught her to read a room for danger before she read it for anything else. She was not about to become the woman who needed rescuing in the middle of someone else's gang war. She had opinions about women in that position, mostly that they didn't survive the sequel. But love, as it turns out, has terrible discretion. It leaks, it hides in coat pockets, and comes out at the worst possible moments. Min Jae found the note on a Sunday, reaching into her coat for a lighter she didn't smoke enough to actually need, and Amara watched something happen to his face that she'd never seen in 2 years of studying it like scripture. The mask didn't crack so much as it simply, briefly stopped existing. Underneath it was something she recognized immediately, because she felt it too. Every time she thought too hard about what loving him actually cost. Fear, dressed up as fury because fury was easier to hold. "How long?" he said. Not a question. A demand wearing the shape of one. "Does it matter?" "It matters that you didn't tell me." "And what would you have done, Min Jae? Burned down the block? Made 3 more enemies to replace the ones you already have?" She took the note back from him, gently, the way you'd take a weapon from someone you loved. "This isn't a problem you fix with a phone call and a body count." He said nothing, which, from a man who commanded silence out of entire rooms for a living, was its own kind of confession. Outside, 3 floors down, a black sedan idled in the dark, patient as a held breath, waiting for either of them to make a mistake worth reporting back on. Neither of them noticed the second car parked half a block further, unmarked, unassuming, and far more interested in them than in Amara's rent. Min Jae did not sleep that night, which was unusual for a man who trained himself to sleep through the sound of his own enemies plotting downstairs. Instead, he sat in the dark of his penthouse office with the folded note in front of him like evidence at a trial only he was presiding over, running through a mental ledger of every man he'd ever wronged, embarrassed, or outbid. The list was, unhelpfully, long. Running a shipping empire that occasionally shipped things the government would have opinions about tended to make a man popular in exactly the wrong circles. By morning, he had 3 names. By noon, he had one. The Yoon family had been circling his territory for the better part of a decade, the way sharks circle anything that bleeds slowly enough to be interesting. Old money, older grudges, and a patriarch who still resented losing the port contracts to Min Jae's father 20 years earlier, a loss he'd apparently decided to make generational. They didn't want Amara. They had never cared about Amara beyond her usefulness as a soft, undefended place to press a knife. What they wanted was Min Jae distracted, destabilized, human enough to make a mistake. He called a meeting the way other men call a doctor, reluctantly. and only once the situation had become undeniable. His second, a wiry, permanently unimpressed man named Ji-hoon, listened to the plan with the expression of someone watching a car he'd warned against buying finally break down on the highway. "You want to what?" Ji-hoon said flatly. "Remove 3 members of the Yoon family from a gala, in public, with witnesses. I want them to understand consequences. You want revenge, which is different from strategy and considerably more likely to end with you in a cell or a coffin." Ji-hoon set down his coffee with the deliberate calm of a man managing a client and not just a boss. "You bury 3 of their people. They bury 3 of yours. Then Amara. Then it doesn't stop, because it never stops. That's not how this business works, and you know it." Min Jae knew it. Knowing it did not make it easier to sit still. It was Amara, arriving unannounced with takeout she'd bought specifically to have an excuse to check on him, who finally said the thing neither man in that room had been willing to say out loud. "You'll win the fight," she said, setting the containers down like she was diffusing something, "and lose the war. Every enemy you bury creates 2 more, who remember my name specifically. Because now I'm not just your weakness. I'm the reason you're vulnerable enough to bury people over. You'll be protecting me into a target the size of Seoul." "So what? I do nothing?" "You do something smarter." She sat across from him, and for a moment the room's tension deferred to her the way rooms tended to, eventually, once people stopped underestimating her. "You make me disappear. Not literally. Just as a weakness. If the whole city believes you feel nothing for me, there's nothing left for them to collect." The silence that followed had weight to it, the specific gravity of an idea that was both brilliant and unbearable in equal measure. "You're asking me to humiliate you. I'm asking you to save my life using the one skill you're actually good at, lying to a room full of people who deserve it." A ghost of her usual sarcasm slipped through, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Somewhere, Min Jae, in this city built on men who collect what they can't have, is a version of us that gets to stay soft. This isn't that version. Not yet. If you've ever had to choose between protecting someone and being honest with them, drop a comment below, because Amara's about to find out that love, in a world run by men like the Yoon family, sometimes only survives by pretending to be dead. Subscribe if you believe some sacrifices are worth making. Only the cynical scroll past. Min Jae looked at her for a long time, long enough that Ji-hoon quietly excused himself, muttering something about checking the perimeter that fooled absolutely no one. "There's a gala Friday," Min Jae finally said. "The Yoons will be there. Half the city will be there." "Good," Amara said. And if her voice shook only slightly, she was fairly certain he was kind enough not to mention it. "Then let's give them a show." Neither of them noticed, that same afternoon, a man in an unremarkable car photographing the restaurant they'd just left, cataloging, patiently, the exact shape of a lie that hadn't been told yet. Friday arrived with the particular cruelty of a day you cannot stop, no matter how badly you want to. Amara spent the morning at the gallery pretending to catalog a shipment of paintings she couldn't focus on. In the afternoon, in a dress fitting where the stylist kept asking if she was excited, and Amara kept answering yes, with the flat conviction of a woman rehearsing a lie she'd need to sell later to a much harder audience. Min Jae spent the day the way he spent every day before violence, real or performed, methodically. He reviewed the guest list twice. He confirmed the Yoon family's RSVP 3 times, as though it might have changed its mind out of mercy. He stood in front of his own mirror at 6 p.m., straightened a tie that did not need straightening, and rehearsed silently the exact tone of contempt he'd need to manufacture for a woman he'd spent 2 years failing to stop loving. It is a specific kind of hell, learning to sound cruel to someone you'd bleed for. The Grand Hyatt ballroom that night looked the way money always looks when it's trying to prove a point. Obscene chandeliers, a string quartet playing something nobody was actually listening to, and enough camera crews to suggest that somebody, somewhere, was hoping for a scandal. They got one, just not the one they expected. Amara arrived on Min Jae's arm the way she always did at these things, poised and unreadable. Though tonight, the poise cost her considerably more than usual. She could feel the Yoon family's attention on her from across the room before she even located them. 3 men in expensive suits, watching with the specific patience of hunters who'd already decided how the evening would end. One of them, the youngest, smiled at her. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man confirming he'd found the right pressure point. "They're here," she murmured, not moving her lips much, a skill she'd apparently absorbed from 2 years of proximity to organized crime. "I see them." "Minjae?" She caught his sleeve, just for a second, just long enough to say the thing she needed to say before the performance started, and there was no more room for softness. "Whatever happens tonight, I know, okay? I know what's real." "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't say that now. I need to be someone else in about 4 minutes, and you saying that makes it considerably harder." A reporter found them near the bar, exactly on schedule. Ji-hoon had made sure of it, feeding just enough information to just the right gossip columnist to guarantee an audience with the reach they needed. She was young, hungry, holding a phone up before she'd even finished her question. "Mr. Kang, there's been speculation about the woman you've been seen with. Care to comment?" The room, in the specific way rooms full of powerful people do, quietly began listening without appearing to listen at all. Minjae's face did the thing Amara had only seen it do in boardrooms, right before he ended someone's career with a sentence. Cold, precise, absolutely without mercy. "There's nothing to comment on," he said, and his voice carried exactly as far as it needed to. "She works at one of my galleries. We had dinner a handful of times. I think she mistook professional kindness for something it wasn't." The reporter blinked. "So, there's no relationship. There's no anything." He looked directly at Amara as he said it, and she understood, with the particular horror of an actress watching her scene partner commit fully to the bit, that he'd chosen to look at her specifically so the cameras would catch the moment her face didn't move. A distraction. Nothing more. "I'd appreciate it if the next question wasn't about my staff's personal delusions." Somewhere behind her, she heard a woman laugh. Not unkindly, just with the reflexive cruelty of people who enjoy watching someone else's humiliation because it isn't theirs. Somewhere else, she registered pity, which was somehow worse. Amara stood very still, the way she'd learned to stand still through customer complaints, through condescending gallery patrons, through immigration officers who looked at her passport a little too long. She let the words land and did not let her face confirm that they'd landed anywhere at all. "Thank you for your honesty," she said instead, loud enough for the reporter's phone to catch it, soft enough that only Min-jae would hear the crack underneath it. Then she turned and walked toward the doors and did not run, because running would have ruined the only thing she had left to control. Across the room, on the balcony above them all, a man lowered his phone, having recorded every unbearable second of it, and smiled the smile of someone who has just found something worth more than anything for sale in that entire glittering room. Grief has a strange sense of timing. It waits until you're alone in an elevator, or brushing your teeth, or in Amara's case, standing in the marble lobby bathroom of the Grand Hyatt, with the door locked and her hands braced against a sink, cold enough to remind her she was still, technically, alive. She did not cry. She'd promised herself that much in the cab on the way over, that whatever happened in that ballroom, she would not hand anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart in real time. So instead, she stood there, breathing in 4 counts and out for 6, the way a therapist she couldn't really afford had once taught her, and reminded herself, with the flat conviction of someone reciting a fact rather than believing it, this was the plan. You asked for this. He didn't betray you. He obeyed you. It didn't help nearly as much as she'd hoped. By the time she left the bathroom, composed enough to pass for fine under bad lighting, the gala had moved on the way galas do. Gossip has a short attention span when there's more champagne to drink and more people to impress. Nobody stopped her on her way out. Nobody offered her a coat. The valet, at least, was kind, which felt like the first honest interaction she'd had all night. She didn't see the man from the balcony follow her out. She wouldn't learn his name for another 4 days. Detective Hwang Seo-jun, formerly of the Seoul Metropolitan Police's Organized Crime Division, currently employed by absolutely no one but himself, having quit the force 2 years earlier after a case against the Yoon family collapsed under the weight of bribed judges and a chief who'd suddenly discovered he liked his pension more than his principals. What she would learn eventually was that Hwang had spent those 2 years building a private, patient, thoroughly illegal file on everyone who'd ever wronged him, and that Kang Min-jae's name sat near the top of it, right below the Yoon's. For reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with old business Min-jae's father had left unfinished. What Hwang had not expected, watching that performance from the balcony, was to find something more useful than a decade of shipping fraud paperwork. He'd found a lie so well constructed it had fooled an entire ballroom of professionally suspicious people. A lie that meant, if he played this correctly, he wouldn't need Min-jae's crimes at all. He'd need Amara. Back at his own penthouse, Min-jae stood at the window with a glass of something he had no intention of drinking, replaying the reporter's question and his own answer on a loop that had already made itself permanent, the way ugly things do. Ji-hoon found him there an hour later, having personally confirmed that the Yoon family had left the gala satisfied, disinterested, and, critically, no longer watching Amara's building. "It worked," Ji-hoon said carefully. "I know. You did the right thing. I know that too." Min-jae didn't turn around. "Doesn't mean I have to enjoy knowing it. If you've ever had to hurt someone to keep them safe, you already know the particular silence that follows, the kind no apology fully fixes. Comment below if you think Amara made the right call, or if some sacrifices cost more than they're worth. Like this story, if you believe real love doesn't need an audience to prove itself. Only the Yoon family types, the ones who profit off other people's pain, would scroll past without hitting subscribe. 3 days passed in the particular gray fog of a breakup that both people know is fake, and both people are still required to grieve. Amara went to work. She cataloged paintings she didn't care about. She let Adaye's bring her soup and did not correct her friend's assumption that the breakup was real, because the alternative, explaining an elaborate criminal deception over instant noodles, seemed like a lot to ask of a Tuesday. Min-jae, for his part, buried himself in ledgers and legitimate business and the specific busywork Min used to avoid feeling things, until the morning his private line rang from a number he didn't recognize, and a voice he'd never heard before said 4 words that ended whatever peace either of them had bought with their public heartbreak. "I know it's fake." Min-jae did not, as a rule, take unknown calls. His number changed every 8 months, filtered through 3 layers of security that had cost more than most people's houses. And yet, here was a stranger's voice on the other end of it, calm as a man ordering coffee, saying the 4 words that made every hair on his arm stand at attention. "I know it's fake. Who is this?" Detective Hwang Seo-jun, formerly. A pause, deliberate, theatrical in the way of a man who'd waited a long time to be the one holding leverage instead of losing it. "I watched the whole performance from the balcony Friday night, Mr. Kang. Very convincing. Genuinely. If I hadn't spent 6 years learning to read liars for a living, I might have believed it too." Min-jae's hand tightened around the phone hard enough to whiten his knuckles. "What do you want?" "Not money. I have a modest amount of that already. Thanks to a settlement your father's lawyers were forced to pay me 2 years ago, right before your father's people made sure I lost my badge over it." Huang's voice stayed pleasant, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "I want the Yoon family's shipping manifests. The real ones. I know you have copies. Men like you always keep insurance. Give me what I need to bury them properly, legally, permanently, and your little secret stays exactly that. A secret. And if I refuse, then I release the footage to every outlet that watched you humiliate her Friday night, alongside a very compelling narrative about a mafia boss and the reporter he manipulated into running a false story, which, incidentally, is a much bigger scandal than a breakup. It'll follow her for years. Immigration tends to take a special interest in foreign nationals connected to organized crime cover-ups, Mr. Kang. I'd know. I used to be the one taking the interest." The line went quiet. Min-jae understood, with the particular clarity of a man who'd spent his life reading threats for a living, that this was not a bluff. Hwang wasn't interested in money or headlines. He was interested in the Yoon's burning, and he'd found the one lever guaranteed to make Min-jae pull it himself. 24 hours, Hwang said, and hung up before Min-jae could answer. He told Amara that evening, in her apartment, the first time either of them had been in the same room since the gala without an audience to perform for. She listened with her arms crossed and her face doing the careful, controlled thing it did when she was deciding how angry to allow herself to be. "So the plan worked," she said finally. "And now we're being blackmailed by the person the plan was supposed to fool." "He wasn't fooled. He's not the Yoons. He's worse. He's smart, and he's got nothing left to lose. That makes 2 of us, apparently." She sat down heavily, the exhaustion of the last week finally catching up to her all at once. "Min-jae, if you hand him those manifests, the Yoon family goes down. Which sounds good, until you remember they have friends. Friends who'll assume it was you who talked." "I know. And if you don't hand them over, he releases the footage, and either way, I become the headline." The foreign woman caught in a mob war. Do you know what that does to someone who spent 6 years proving she belongs somewhere? Her voice cracked on the last word. The first real crack she'd allowed since the gala, and she hated herself a little for it. I didn't survive customs interviews and condescending gallery patrons and immigration renewals just to become a cautionary tale in someone else's power struggle. Min Jae crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair, which was, for a man who did not kneel for anyone, its own kind of confession. Then we don't let him choose the ending. Meaning what? Meaning Huang wants leverage. Fine. We give him something else to want. A thought was forming behind his eyes. The same cold, methodical calculation he brought to boardrooms and body counts alike, except this time aimed somewhere neither of them had tried pointing it before. He hates the Yoons more than he hates me. That's not loyalty to justice, Amara. That's personal. And personal things have weaknesses, professional things don't. For the first time since the gala, something that wasn't quite hope, but was standing very close to it, crossed her face. You're going to turn his own leverage against him. I'm going to give a desperate man exactly what he wants, Min Jae said quietly, and let him destroy the people who actually deserve it, while making sure he never gets the chance to touch you at all. Outside, unnoticed by either of them, a black sedan that did not belong to the Yoon family idled once more at the curb, its driver watching the apartment with the patient, proprietary interest of a man who believed, incorrectly, that he already held every card in this game. The plan Min Jae built over the next 4 days had the particular elegance of a man finally doing what he was actually good at, not protecting Amara by disappearing her, but protecting her by making the people who threatened her disappear instead. He called Huang back within the 24 hours, agreed to the manifests, and handed over documents that were real in every detail except one, the dates. Min Jae had learned long ago, from a father who treated paperwork like poetry, that a single altered timestamp could turn an airtight case into a house of cards, evidence that looked identical to the untrained eye, but would collapse the moment a defense attorney found the seam. He wasn't handing Huang a weapon. He was handing him a trap with a very long fuse, one built to detonate only after Huang had already burned every bridge he had left trying to use it. Huang, drunk on the nearness of the revenge he'd spent 2 years rehearsing, didn't check the seams. He went straight to the one journalist in Seoul, still willing to touch organized crime reporting, the same one from the gala. And Min Jae, through Ji-hoon, made sure she got a second, quieter tip alongside Huang's, that the disgraced detective feeding her documents had a documented history of falsifying evidence against the very family he was now accusing, complete with the internal affairs file that had actually cost him his badge, buried 2 years ago under a mountain of favors, and now, conveniently, unburied. The story that ran wasn't the one Huang wanted. It was worse for him. A rogue ex-cop with a vendetta, manipulating evidence in a personal war against a family with the money to sue him into the ground, which the Yoons, humiliated and eager for a distraction from their own exposed manifests, did with theatrical enthusiasm. Huang's threat against Amara died quietly under an avalanche of his own credibility, and somewhere in the wreckage, the Yoon family's actual crimes. The real dates Min Jae had leaked separately, through channels nobody could trace back to him, landed exactly where they needed to, without a single name of Kang Min Jae's attached to any of it. It was, Ji-hoon admitted afterward with something close to admiration, the cleanest thing he'd ever watched Min Jae do. No bodies, no funerals, just a very patient, very expensive lie, aimed with surgical precision at the two men who tried to use one against him first. Amara found out it was over the way she'd found out everything lately. From Min Jae, standing in her doorway at an hour too late for good news and too early for bad, holding nothing but himself for the first time in weeks. It's done, he said. The Yoons are finished. Huang's discredited. Nobody's watching your building anymore. She should have felt relief immediately. Instead, she felt the specific, delayed shock of a person setting down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten what standing up straight felt like. And the gala? The story? Stays exactly as ugly as it needs to stay, publicly. But privately, he stepped closer, and for the first time in weeks, didn't perform anything at all. Privately, I need you to know none of it was true. Not one word. I've never once, in 2 years, mistaken you for a distraction. I know, she said, and this time when her voice cracked, she let it. I told you at the gala. I always knew. Knowing didn't stop it from hurting. No, she agreed. It didn't. He didn't apologize with words. Min Jae had never been fluent in them, and she'd long since stopped expecting the vocabulary from a man raised on ledgers instead of feelings. Instead, he did the thing dangerous men rarely allow themselves. He stood in her doorway, in full view of a street he no longer needed to watch, and reached for her hand in public without checking first who might be looking. Nobody was. That was the point. The city that had once collected them as a weakness had finally, mercifully, stopped paying attention. Seoul doesn't forgive softness, she murmured against his chest, half a joke, half the truest thing she'd learned since arriving. Good thing we're not asking for forgiveness. Somewhere across the city, the Yoon family packed offices they no longer controlled, and a disgraced detective drafted a resume nobody would read. And in a quiet doorway that finally belonged to no one but them, love did the one thing it had never been allowed to do in that entire glittering, dangerous city. It stayed.